Hey, I'm Justin. This is Lesser Duck Tutorials, and welcome to part 2 for the inventory in the point-and-click adventure game in Unreal tutorial series. So, where we left off last is in the widget blueprint inventory, and what we're going to do first is kind of categorize these item slots into a category called item slots, interestingly. And then we'll put the arrows in another category that we'll just call something creative like arrows. And we can get rid of the pre-construct and the event tick, and then we'll select each of the arrow buttons and we'll implement the on-clicked event. Then we'll create a new variable that we're going to call inventory slots. And this needs to be of a type item slot. And then on the right side, we're going to change it to an array. Now we'll create a macro that we're going to call add slots to array. And this will just go through and make sure right at the beginning that we're adding each of these item slots to an array that we can access later. And we'll just create the in and out pins. And what we want to do is drag in the inventory slots variable. And from that, we'll find the clear node, so we can clear it right at the beginning just in case it's already populated. And then we'll drag in the inventory slots again, and we'll find the add node. And the first one we're going to add is the top item 1. And we're going to go left to right, top to bottom, and we'll just add each one. So the next one is top item 2, top item 3, top item 4, and then bottom item 1, bottom item 2, bottom item 3, and bottom item 4. And make sure that they're all added. And then we will run the add slots to array on the event construct. Now let's add another macro that we're going to call calculate MaxRowIndex. And then we will add the in and out pins. And what this is going to do is see how many rows we have in our inventory based on the inventory amount. So if we get the adventure instance, and from that we'll get the inventory, and then from that we'll get the length, we can assign this length to a variable that we'll make that we can just call, inventory length or whatever. And we'll set that right at the beginning. And we can comment that so we know what this is at a glance. And again, make this black. I don't know how people live with that being white. It's so hard to read. And then we're going to see if the length is greater than 8, meaning 8 items on the screen. If it's greater, that means we can move the rows. So we'll want to know if that's the case. So we can comment that and also say, check if inventory length is more than 2 rows. And then just to visualize what this means, if you look at the inventory, you'll see there are 8 item slots at any given time, meaning, if there's more than 8 items, then we can hit this down arrow to see the next row, and then the next row if we hit the down arrow again, etc. So for false, I'm just going to add a temporary reroute node. And then for true, I'll do another reroute node. And we need to make sure that we figure out what happens if either of these are the case. So let's add a variable that we'll call MaxRowIndex. Now, what is this? So if you were to look at your inventory and you have 8 or less items, you'll be at index 0, meaning nothing's changed, 0 is the base. We don't need to worry about the arrows moving. If we get up to 4 more items, in addition to what this is, then a new row is added. This new row, to see it, that would be changing it from index 0 to index 1. And index 1 would show the last row of index 0, and then it would show the additional row of items. And also, if you were to get up to 4 more items than this, you would actually move to index 2, meaning it would show the last row of index 1 and then the next row of new items. And then the row index will increase or decrease depending on how many times you click these arrows. So hitting down will increase the row index and hitting up will decrease it. However, we want to find the max row index, meaning we need to calculate how many items we have total and how many rows that takes up. So if we're checking if we have more than 8 items and that's false, then we need to make sure the max row index is equal to 0. So the first thing we'll do is check if it is already 0. And if it is not, we'll set it to 0. And if it is already 0, we're good. We can actually just leave immediately. So we'll just add a comment on this bottom part and say, if 2 rows or less, check if max row index is 0. Now we need to see what happens if we have more than 8 items. So the first thing we'll do is we'll get the inventory length, and then we're going to subtract 8 so that we know how many extra items we have. Then we're going to divide using the float divided by float, and we're going to divide by 4 because the return value is going to be a decimal most likely. And then we're going to use the ceiling node, which rounds the number up to the next whole number, and then we're going to set that to the max row index. And here's what we're doing. So if we have a total of 10 items and we subtract 8, that's going to leave a remainder of 2 items. So if we divide that by 4, then it's going to be 0.5, and if we do the ceiling, then it's going to round up to 1. And if it rounds up to 1, that means our index number is set to 1, which you can see here shows that it will go to that second row. And this will work for all of the index numbers. So now that we've assigned that, we can add a comment and just say update max row index to appropriate amount. And then that will go to the output. And then you can compile and save. Now create a new macro that we'll call update current row index. This function won't determine what happens when the arrows are pressed, but it will determine what happens when you get a new item. So create a new variable, and it's going to be called arrow used, and set that to the type bool. And this will be set on these onClicked events later, and that will help us determine whether or not we need to update the row. So we'll do a branch for the arrow used to determine if it has been used. And if it has been used, then we're going to set it back to false and immediately leave. However, if it has not been used, we'll create a new variable called CurrentRowIndex and switch it to an integer. And what we'll be doing is setting this to the max row index. What this does is if we get a new item, it will update this. We haven't used the arrow, and it will just move it to the end of the inventory. Now in the event graph, make sure that calculate max row index is after add slots to array, and then update current row index is after that. Now let's figure out these onClicked events. So we'll get the adventure controller first, and then from that we're going to interrupt the action. So anytime the player clicks on the arrows, we're going to clear any sort of verbs that are active so we can actually just update the inventory as needed. So next we want to get the inventory length, and we're going to check if the length is greater than 8, because if it is, that means these buttons are going to work, and if it's less than 8, then there's no reason for them to work. We don't need to move to any new rows. So now we can set that the arrow has been used, set that to true, and it's going to be true for both. And the top row here is the down arrow and the bottom row is the up arrow. Sorry if that's a little confusing, but since this top one is the down arrow, we're going to compare the current row index to the max row index and make sure that the current row index is less than the max row, because otherwise the down arrow will go beyond the max row. We don't want it to do that. So we want to make sure that if it's below the max row, we can still use that down arrow. And then for the bottom, we just pull out the current row index and we just see if it's greater than 0, because when we hit the up arrow, we want it to stop at the very first index. Now on both, we're going to be setting the current row index, and that's only if these branches are true. And the current row index for the down arrow will be incremented up, so increment int, and we'll put that right before the setting of the row index. And then for the up arrow, we want to decrement the index. So if you hit minus minus, it'll pop up. And then at the end of this, we need to create a function that will populate the inventory as needed. So create a new function, and we'll call this populate inventory. And then we can plug that in at the end here, and that will complete what we need for the arrows. But now we need to figure out what goes in the populate inventory. So the first thing, it should calculate the max row index, and then it should update the current row index. And let's change the name of inventory slots to item slots. It's a little easier because, it's made up of item slots. And then we'll add a new variable that we'll call item slot index, and this will be of a type integer. And we're going to set that to 0 right at the beginning. Then from that, we'll do a for loop. And what the item slot index does is it goes through each of the 8 slots on your inventory and determines which item needs to be populated in any given slot. So take out the current row index, and we're going to multiply it by 4. That will be the first index of the loop. Now, from the product of the current row index and 4, we're going to add 7 to it. And that will be the last index. Then let's make another variable of a type integer, and we'll name this inventory index. Now, to better illustrate what is happening, we're taking the current row index, multiplying it by 4, and that's our first index. And then our last index is taking that product and adding 7. Well, if you look at an array, the array starts at 0. And if you were to have 16 items in an array, then the first item would be at 0, and the last one would be at number 15. So let's say that we took all of the items at index 0. Well, that would be these 8 items. So if the current row index is 0, you multiply that by 4, and you'll get 0. So the first index will be item 0. So if we add 7, that means we're going all the way up through 8 of these, meaning item 7 is the 8th item. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the last index is right here, and the first index is right here. So what about index 1? That would look like this. 4 times 1, so 4 times the 1. Our start index is 4, and if we add 7, it goes to 11. So now it's these 8 right here that are going to be shown on the screen. And likewise for index 2, that is equal to 8, so our starting item is item 8. And if we add 7, our last item is item 15, meaning we will see all items on these 2 rows. So hopefully that makes sense as to why we're doing a for loop like this. So now that we have the inventory index of the items that we need, let's first do a check to see if the index is less than the inventory length. Because if that's true, we can actually keep adding items, and if it's false, that means there's nothing to add. So if we create a new macro, we'll call this AddItem. Then we'll add the in and out pins. Then we could drag in the item slots, and we'll drag in the item slot index, and we'll get the item slot at that index, and we'll be sure to check if it is valid, even though it most likely will be. And if it's not valid, we'll leave. But if it is valid, then we're going to get that item slot and add the item using the function we made before. The item to add, however, needs to be determined, and we're going to use the inventory index to find that. So we'll get the adventure instance where we can access the inventory, and then we'll get a copy using the inventory index. And then now we have that item to add, and we can add it and then leave. Now we can create another macro, and we'll call this one remove item. That way, if the inventory slot has an item in it already and we've updated the row and there is no inventory item to go in here, we're going to remove all items from that slot and clear it. So we'll get the item slots at the item slot index. We'll check if it's valid, same as before. If it's not valid, we're going to leave, which is a problem, but it should not be. And if it is valid, we just run the remove item function on the item slot. Nothing else to do there. So now let's go ahead and add the remove item to the false of the branch with the add item on the true part of the branch. And we'll get the item slot index and we'll increment it by 1. So now make sure you set it and hook up that integer. And now it will loop through each time and do everything we need for each inventory slot. Next, let's head over to the adventure instance and we'll add a function called AddItem to inventory and add another function called removeItem from inventory. So in the AddItem to inventory function, we'll want to add an input parameter of the type enum item list, and we'll call that item. And then we're going to get data table row. And this is going to be the thing that reads that item data table that we made. However, we have to determine the row name. And if you look at the item list, you'll see the row name here is called pickle, which matches the item. So it won't actually create the name straight from the enum. What we have to do is do enum to string and then connect that to the row name, and that should find the correct row. However, make sure you also set the DT item list as the data table. And now the out row can be split, and you'll see that it has the parts that make up our item struct. And if you drag out from the row class, you can get the construct object from class node. And this is going to create the object. And if you drag out from the outer pin, you just find a reference to self, and this means who owns this item. And the adventure instance is a good owner for this. Then from the return value, we're going to set the adventure controller. If you remember, on our item, we have that adventure controller variable. Well, this is where we set it. So we'll set that here, and we'll get a reference to the adventure controller using our function library, and we'll just plug that in there. Cool, now that the item has been created and the adventure controller has been set immediately, it can now work as needed. And so we'll add it to the inventory, and also we want to drag in a reference from that return value to add it to our inventory. And then we'll want to get the HUD, and from that we'll get our widget blueprint for the inventory, and we'll fire the populate inventory function. And if you remember, since we added an item, it will move it to the MaxRowIndex and then add that item. So now in the remove item from inventory function, we want to pass in another item list parameter because we need to determine what item we're removing. Then we drag in the inventory array and we'll do a for each loop with break because the first time we find this item, we want to stop. So from the array element, we'll get the name of the item. And if you drag out from that and search for equals equals, we'll do the equal string. And then from the inventory item that we're passing through, convert it to a string, and then we can compare it with the array element's name. And then we'll branch from that, and the loop body will go to this branch. So we're checking each item. Does the name match the item? And then we'll make a new variable that we'll call temp item of a type BP item. And we can set that here at the end. If the branch is true, then the array element will link right up to that. And then, if that's also true, we're wanting to break the for each loop. So make sure it also connects to the break input node of that for each loop. Then we're going to get the temp item, since now we have it. We're going to check if it's valid, which it should be, but it's always good to check. And then we're going to get the inventory array and remove this item from this array. So you can drag in that temp item and hook it up to the item to remove. Now we'll want to set the temp item back to null. And then we'll get the HUD, get the inventory, and populate the inventory. And then if it's not valid, it also will populate the inventory. Sweet. Now over in the Hotspot poster, let's remove that print string node, and we're going to add the add item to inventory. However, we don't have one on the Hotspot yet. So let's go to the Hotspot, and we'll add that function called add item to inventory. And then we'll add another one called remove item from inventory. Then we'll need to add the input variables of the type item list and just call it item. Remember, we're passing it down the chain. And so now we don't have a function to go to from here, so we have to open the adventure controller. And then we'll create a new custom event that we'll call task add item to inventory. Then we can get the adventure instance. And then from that, we're going to add item to inventory. And then we have to pass in the item list enum, call it item, and hook that up. And then we'll want to increment the task index. And we might as well add the other custom event we need, which is task remove item from inventory. And then it also will run the remove item from inventory on the adventure instance. And of course, we also have to, again, pass in that item reference and hook that up, and then increment the task index. And now we can finish out the rest of them. So back in the Hotspot, we can get the adventure controller, run the task add item to inventory, hook that up, and then switch over to the remove item from inventory, do the same thing. We'll pass in the item, and then we'll get the adventure controller and run the task remove item from inventory function. Then back in the Hotspot poster, we're going to call the add item to inventory, and we'll select the pickle in the dropdown. Now let's open the HUD and go to the graph and open up the set interaction text function. Let's first duplicate the interaction variable just to clean things up. And we'll select everything on the top here, and we will collapse to a macro. And we'll call this macro set hotspot text. And then we'll organize this stuff around a bit, make it a little cleaner. And then we'll add that output pin of the exec type, and we'll just say not hotspot. And then if it's not valid, we'll head to that not hotspot node. And then we'll want to make another one that is for the item text. So if we create a new macro, we'll call this set inventory text. Then we can add those in and out pins. And we'll just put that into the set interaction text function real quick. Cool. Now we'll head back to the inventory text function. And what we'll do first is we'll grab that player controller, and from that we'll say get target inventory slot. And then from that we'll see if it's valid. Then if it is valid, we want to see if the inventory slot has an item. So drag out from the inventory slot and we'll get the inventory item. And then from that, we'll do an other is valid and hook that up to the is valid on the previous is valid node. And let's change the name of the output to not item. And the is not valid will go to this output for both of these is valid nodes. Now, if it is valid, we're going to get the player controller. We're going to get the active verb. And then from the active verb, we're going to see if it's equal to walk to. Then you can drag in the reference to the widget blueprint for the interaction, and we'll set the text, and you can hook that up to the true output of that branch. And to determine what text we're going to set, we can drag out from this inventory item and get the name, and we'll drag that over and we'll append. But make sure it's not connected to the A input pin, but it should be connected to the B. And then in the A, we'll type in look at and add a space, and then connect that to the text to set in the set text node. Now, we have to determine if the active verb is not equal to walk to. So we'll move this up a bit. And if it is not equal to walk to, then we want it to say whatever it is. So the false will also go to a set text node. But we need to create the string that will be set if this is the case. So we can take all of this and move it down a bit. And we'll take the active verb and we'll draw out from that and we will convert it to a string. And then from that string we'll append. And it will be the active verb plus the target name. And then that will go to the set text to set. All right, cool. Now I think we can test it out. And a little bit of a fair warning, if this doesn't work, try restarting the editor. I had to do that to get this to work. Now we will pick up the poster, and we have the pickle. So now it says look at pickle if we hover over it. And if we select a verb and go over it, it will say use pickle, but there's no space. So let's go add that space in real quick. And then if you go to the set inventory text, you can see that append node. We need to add another pin and make B a space. So it's the active verb and then a space and then the name of the item. So if we test it out, we can pick up the poster, get the pickle, look at pickle, and then look at pickle, pull pickle. It all looks good and it fires as it should. So we are good there. That's one step in the right direction. So now we can try to see if the arrows work. So if you keep picking up the poster, we can fill our inventory up. All right, and then one more, it should go to the next row, and it does. And then if we hit the up arrow, it'll go up to the previous. If we hit the down arrow, it doesn't appear to be working. So there's something that we need to figure out here. So back in the inventory, you can see I actually didn't link up these increment and decrements. So once you do that, then we can go back into the Hotspot poster, and we're just going to do a quick pickup. We're not going to play the animation. So we can just, from the event on pickup, we'll face the hotspot, we'll add the item to their inventory, and then we will clear the verb. And then we might as well figure out a way to remove items. So let's just override something like on close. And then we'll face the hotspot here, and then we'll remove the item from our inventory, select the pickle, and then clear the verb. So now let's test this out and see how it works. All right, so you can pick up the poster. It immediately adds. We don't have to wait. And we'll just pick them up until the inventory is above 8. One more, and there we go. And so if we hit the arrow up, it should go to the top, and it does. And if we hit the arrow down, it does. It moves down, and it won't go below that, and it won't go above 0. So now we can close the poster, and we remove that one inventory, and the arrows don't work anymore. Close the poster again. We can remove more. Everything appears to be working very well, and this is great. So let's move on. So in the description is another zip file, and in that is going to be a few things. And we want to take the knife image, the pickle key image, and the pickup knife image, and we're going to put them in the items folder within the textures folder. Make sure you apply paper 2D settings on all of them, and then also convert them to sprites. And then I'm just organizing them into a couple folders. Now I want to do some changes, and I'm going to open the item data struct, and I'm just going to remove this item list enum variable because it's not really even being used. And then in the items folder, I'm going to create the blueprints for the other items. So I'll make a new BP item blueprint, and I'll call it BP item knife. And then I'll make another one, and I'm going to call this BP item pickle key. And then I'm going to head over to the enumerations and open up the item list, and I'll add these two new items into this. So one for knife and another one for pickle key, and I'll make sure that it has no spaces and everything is lowercase. And I'll save that. Now I can head to the BP item list data table, and I'll add two entries. The first one will be for the knife, and I'll select the BP item knife class, and I'll rename the row to knife. And then I'll add another for the pickle key, selecting the correct class and renaming it to pickle key with no space, all lowercase. Now if I open the BP item, I want to rename the name variable to description, and I'll add a new variable of type item list, and I'll name that item. So now I can actually open the individual blueprints for the items and make sure that I select the correct item in the dropdown. And while you're at it, be sure to select the correct thumbnail and type in the description for the knife and the pickle key in the class defaults. Now since we made those changes, if we go to the adventure instance and the remove item from inventory, let's change this check for the strings, and instead we'll get the item of the array element and compare it to the item we pass in, and then we'll use that to determine if we should move forward or not. Next, let's open the tower exterior level by itself, and we can delete that recast nav mesh object so we can see the floor. And we want to drag in the knife pickup so that we can pick it up off of the ground over here. But first we need some sort of hotspot script for this pickup. So we'll make a new blueprint class based off of hotspot, and we'll call this BP underscore pickup. And if we open that, then what we need to add is a sprite. So we can add a component of a type paper sprite, and we'll call it pickup sprite. So if you select the pickup sprite, we want to switch the rotation on the x-axis to -90. So if we were looking at the top and make it lit, and we put a sprite in there, you could see that this is what it would look like if it was placed in the level. So now we want to make a new blueprint for this specific knife based off of the pickup blueprint. And we'll call this BP underscore pickup underscore knife. Now we need to make a mesh for this knife. So if we drag in the sprite into the world and set the rotation on the x-axis to -90, then we can set the Z position to something like 1, so it's above the ground. We can select modes and switch to the brush editing mode and select pen and deselect the convex polygons and change the extrude depth to 4. Then we can outline kind of a generous little area that the mouse can go over to select the knife. Then we create the static mesh, save it in the meshes folder, and we can call this one pickup underscore knife. And then we can delete the mesh from the level as well as the sprite. And now don't forget to open the new mesh and assign the hotspot material. Now we can select the pickup knife and drag it into the world, but we need to assign the static mesh for the knife. And while we're here, we can say that the hotspot description may be just knife, and the facing direction will be down. And then we make sure that the Z location is maybe 2, so it's above the ground. And we'll change the walk to position to be around here, which could be 38 on the Y and 106 on the X. And then we want to see where the sprite is. So if we just go to the blueprint and select the pickup sprite, we can select the sprite to be that new image, the pickup knife sprite. And now it should be in the level. So if we were to go back to the adventure data and save selected, we can see that the knife exists in the world. However, it's not reading the mouse over, so we could make sure that the collision preset on the sprite is set to no collision. But make sure you're setting this in the BP pickup blueprint, not the knife blueprint. And if we test it out, now you can see that the mouse over event is working and you can walk to the knife correctly. All right, now in the event graph for the pickup knife, let's determine what happens. So if we use the pickup verb on this knife, then we will face the hotspot. We will add the item to our inventory. Make sure you select knife. And then maybe we'll bark and say something like, "Oh, it's a knife." Something Christopher Walken would say. And then we would clear the verb at the end. But we also want to remove the knife from the world. So if we go to the BP pickup blueprint, we can create a function that just says hide pickup. And then we could tag that on the end of this chain here. And then that will complete everything we need there. But we need to determine what hide pickup does. So if we take that static mesh and the pickup sprite and we drag them into the graph, for the pickup sprite, we can do set visibility and make sure that that new visibility is false. And from the mesh component, we will set collision enabled and make sure the new type is set to no collision. Now, if we test it out, we can pick up the knife, walks over, and it disappears from the scene and goes into our inventory. Perfect. And then we could pick up the poster and it would add that pickle to our inventory. And now we have 2 items in our inventory and it's looking good. Now I want to head over to the interface that we made before for the verb interactions and select the on item used and just remove that item input. We don't really need that. And then we'll make a new function called on item given. And then we could save this. And that's all that we'll need to do in there. And then let's head to the enumeration verb used. And we're going to add 2 verbs to the end of this that won't really be shown, but we will use it for our own logic. And that's going to be use item and give item. And then you can save that and close that too. Now in the adventure controller, let's create a variable that we'll call isUsingItem, and it will be of the type Boolean. And then make another one called isGivingItem, and then a third called activeItem, and the activeItem is going to be of the type itemList. And then you can compile and save that. Then we'll head to the interrupt action function and we'll move all this stuff at the end down because we want to clear these in this function. So each one is using item, is giving item, both of those will become false, and the active item will be none. Then in the BP item, we have to fix this whole on event item used section because we're no longer making that check. And we can disconnect everything for now. And what we're going to do is first bring in the adventure controller, and we're going to get the active item, and then we're going to compare it to the item that we assigned in the actual item blueprint, and we're going to see if they're equal. And if they are equal, meaning we're using an item on itself, we don't want to do anything except for take the adventure controller and run the interrupt action. And then we can select all of this stuff and collapse it to a macro that we'll just call item is self. And in there, we'll make the in and out pins. And the only way it leaves the out, which instead of calling it out, we'll just call it no. And the only way it runs to this is if that branch is false. Otherwise, it will not leave this macro. And that will go right at the beginning of event on item used. And then we want to make another macro that will determine if the item is interactable. So create that new macro and we'll call it item is interactable item. And what this is going to do is a lot like the other one. However, it's not checking if the player's active item is equal to the item. Instead, it's checking if the player's active item is equal to the interactable item that we've chose. And then we're branching from that, and if it's false, it leaves. And if it's true, what we need to do is fire the item combine success function. And back in the event graph, we can delete the item combine success. And once we hook up the item is interactable item macro, we can run straight to the item combine fail. And then we'll get the adventure controller and interrupt the action. Now, in the BP item, I used a macro before for the item bark, but the macro is not usable in children of this blueprint, so we have to convert that to a function. So just copy everything in the macro and move it to a new function and hook up everything. And then in the event graph, just drag in the bark function and copy the bark text and paste it in the new function, and do that for all of these. Now with that done, we can actually complete the onUse logic. And if we take in the adventure controller, we'll set isUsingItem to true. And then we will assign the active item to be the current item in this BP item script. And then we will need to set the active verb to be useItem. And lastly, we will call the update interaction text. And then you can copy all of these nodes because we're going to use most of them for the event on give. And you paste that down here, but we can delete the isUsingItem because what we're going to be doing instead is isGivingItem. So make sure that's set to true. And then change the active verb to giveItem. Now you can compile and save that. And delete the item bark macro. We don't need that anymore. Next, in the adventure controller, in the perform item interaction, we can do the last two functions, the useItem and giveItem, by linking those up to onItemUsed and onItemGiven. And then the print strings that we have here as a temporary filler, we can replace those with the correct functions. So find the onUse from the inventory item and connect that up, and same with the onGive. Additionally, while we're here, you'll notice the onOpen function is actually the target is BPI verb interaction. We don't want that. We want it to be a target is BP item. So delete that and redo the onOpen function. And make sure that they're all the correct BP item. Now we can open the HUD because we're going to be updating the set interaction text to take into account if we're giving or using an item. Open the set inventory text macro and create a new string variable that we're going to call interaction string. And then right at the very end, we're going to set this string, and it can be hooked up to the text to set input of the setText function. And then we can disconnect that interaction blueprint and just kind of copy and paste it over, so there's not a line going through everything. And then in the set interaction text function, we want to set the interaction string right before set text again. And then we can open the set hotspot text and do the same thing, set the interaction string right at the end there. Now we want to add a macro at the beginning of this set interaction text function. So let's create a new macro, and we'll call it Preposition Check. Make sure you add the in and out exec pins. And we can just drag it in real quick before we fill out the logic. And then to figure out the logic, we first want to get the player controller, and then we're going to check if it is using an item. And then if we branch from that, we'll determine whether or not we are doing this so we can decide what to do after that. So we'll just add a reroute node for the true, and we'll just put in that we're adding a preposition here. Specifically, we're adding the use preposition. And then if it's false, we're going to do a second check where we check if we are giving an item. And if we are giving an item, we're going to add the give preposition. But if we're not, then we're leaving and we're just going to the out pin. So now let's figure out how to add the preposition. So let's create a new macro called add preposition. And for the input and output, we do the in and out exec pins. However, we also want to add a second input, which is of a type string, because we are passing in what preposition to add to the string. So let's create a variable to store this, and we'll call this current preposition of the type string. And right at the beginning, we can set that to this variable. And then in the preposition check, we might as well add these in before we forget. And then the preposition for is using items, we'll add a space on and then another space. And then for the is giving item, we'll add a space to and another space. So now let's figure out the logic for add preposition. First, we want to get the player controller and drag from that and get the target hotspot, because we want to see, is there a hotspot currently active? So if we see if it's valid, then we can determine whether or not we should be using this verbiage. So if we pull in the interaction widget blueprint reference, we can set the text, and we need to just come up with what the text is that we need to set. Luckily, we have variables that can help us out with this. So first, let's draw out from the target hotspot and get that hotspot description we have. Then we're going to drag in the interaction string and then drag in the current preposition, and we're going to append all of these together. So make sure there's 3 pins and tag them all into the inputs. Then the return value will go to the text to set of the set text node. All right, now we can select all of these and add a comment that says if over hotspot. Now that that is done, we have to determine what happens if we're over an inventory item. Well, the first thing to do is to check if there is an active inventory slot. So get inventory slot. And then we want to check if it is valid and hook that up to the is not valid from the previous valid node. And then we're going to pull out from the target inventory slot and then see if there is an inventory item in it. So we will do a second is valid check, hook that up to the is valid output pin. Next, we want to get the adventure controller. And from that, we're going to get the active item. And then we're going to check if the inventory items, get item, is equal to the active item. And if it is, then we're not going to update the text. But if it's not, we are. So we might as well just change this bool, or this equals, to a not equals. So we can delete that and instead search for exclamation point equals, and then branch from that. Hook that up to the is valid. Clean it up a smidge. And if it is true, it's not equal, then we're going to take the interaction widget blueprint reference, set the text, and then we have to determine the text. But first, let's link up the outputs. So is not valid goes straight out, and then is not valid for this other one connects to that line, and the false of the branch connects to the line 2. Now, let's determine what text we should be setting. Well, we can drag in the interaction string. We can drag in the current preposition. And then from the inventory item, we can get the description. And now we have the 3 things we need to append together. So we'll do the append node and connect all 3 up, and then connect that to the text to set. Now we can add a comment around this section because this is now getting the interaction text for the item. So if over inventory item. And now we have to say if we're not over either one, what do we do? Well, first of all, we don't actually need that output pin, so we can remove that. And we can copy the set text and interaction reference, paste that, and connect that up to that node. And then we could drag in the interaction string and the current preposition, and this is really all we're going to be appending together because nothing is being hovered over, however, we are using a preposition. And then we can just comment here and just say if over nothing. Cool. Now that should be all we need to do here. So if we were to test it out, we could pick up the knife, and now you hover over it, it says look at knife, and it says use knife on if you click it, and now we say on tower door, on poster. That's working perfectly. And now for the give knife to poster, give knife to tower door. It doesn't highlight itself, that works. Now we could try with another item, so we get the pickle, and then we could try use knife on, and then it says pickle, it doesn't say knife, that's perfect. Yep, and it works reverse, and it works with give. So everything appears to be exactly how we want it, which is great. So now we just need to finish the functionality of this, and then we'll be done with the inventory section. Now in the BP item blueprint, we want to make sure we connect the text up to the bark function in the combine item fail function. And then we also want to make sure we're implementing the on item given event, because we didn't have that before. And for this, we can just bark and say something like, I can't give that to an object, you idiot, or something along those lines. So in the adventure controller, let's create a function called combine inventory items. And this is not going to be a task like we were doing on the event graph because there's too much happening, and usually when you combine items, they just remove 2 items from your inventory and add a new one, and then the player usually will say something. So it's all stuff we can do immediately. So we'll just make a function that does this for us. So the thing that we'll want to do is create 4 input parameters, and the first 3 will be items. So it'll be the first item, item 1, and then item 2, and then the new item that we're making. And then the 4th parameter is going to be a string that we're just going to say is text to bark. And what we're wanting to do is create variables for each of these, because if you're running this combine inventory items function from an item, then we want to be able to have this data because we'll be removing the item from our inventory halfway through this function, and then we won't be able to get that data if it's gone. So we're just saving all of the data so that we no longer need the item that we're removing. So right at the beginning, we're setting each of these variables before we remove any items. And then we're also setting that text. And then we're going to run through the chain of events. So the first thing it would do would be remove the first item. So if you get the adventure instance, we can run the remove item function. So remove item from inventory. And the item that we're removing is item 1. And then we're doing the exact same thing using the same adventure instance reference. And the item that we're removing here is item 2. And then we're going to add item to inventory. And the item we're adding is, you guessed it, item to add. And then we're going to bark. So we'll run the player character's bark function. And the text to bark is the text to bark. Lastly, we want to interrupt the action, so we clear the verb. Now over in the item pickle blueprint, we want to override the item combine success function. And all we're going to do is get the adventure controller and run that combine inventory items function, and we'll connect up the item 1, which will be the current item, and item 2 will be the interactable item, and make sure that the interactable item in the pickle blueprint is set to knife, and vice versa. In the knife blueprint, make sure the interactable item is set to pickle. And then we're going to select the pickle key as the new item, and the text to bark will be I carved a pickle key. Then we can copy all of those and then head over to the knife blueprint, do the same thing, and again, make sure interactable item is set to pickle in the knife blueprint. Now we can test it out, and we'll pick up the knife. So we got that, we'll pick up the pickle, and then we will use the knife with the pickle. And now it created the pickle key. He says that he created it. It appears in our inventory. The other items are gone, and the verb has been cleared, so everything is working well. Now we need to have a door to use this key on. So in the tower exterior level, we can hide that BP door so we can see where the door is. And we can go to the blueprints folder, and we're going to create a new BP pickup blueprint. Not a hotspot, but a pickup, because we're going to have a sprite on there. And we're going to name this BP pickup underscore locked door. So if we drag it into the level, we can change the Z position to 2 so it's above the background. And let's open up the blueprint and select the sprite, and we're just going to look for the door sprite, and I believe that was in the first video's assets in this tutorial series. And then we're going to select the static mesh, and we could just choose the door to tower interior that we made earlier. And the hotspot description can just be locked door, and the facing direction can be down. Now we can't really see, so let's just clear the static mesh for now and hide the door. And then we can drag the sprite to where it needs to be. Then we can re-show the door and reselect the static mesh. And now it's in place. And the only thing to do now is to set the walk to position to be equal to the walk to position of the door itself. And that's at 30 on the X and 40 on the Y. So now we need to set up the hotspot to do kind of the same thing that the items did. So if you open the BP hotspot, we can override the onItemUsed and the onItemGiven functions, and then head over to the adventure controller, the perform interaction macro, and we can just connect up the useItem and giveItem to these functions. So now in the hotspot, we can set the base reaction. So we'll be facing the hotspot and we'll bark and say something like, I don't think that will do anything. And then clear the verb at the end. And this is for the onItemGiven, because we're not going to be ever really giving an item to an object. But the onItemUsed is going to require a little bit more. So let's create a new variable called interactable item of the type item list. And then we can get that and see if it's equal to the active item on the player controller. And then we'll do an AND node, and we'll just check to see if the interactable item is not equal to none. Probably don't need to do this, but it won't hurt. And then we'll do a branch. So we need two functions, one for the item use succeed, and then another for the item use failed. And this is just because we can override these in other hotspots. And then tack them on at the end of the branch, so failed goes to false, and then true to succeed. If you copy these three, face hotspot, bark, and clear verb, we can open up the use failed and just put that in there. And then on the item use succeed, we'll just temporarily put a print string succeed, and this will only fire if we haven't filled this out on the appropriate hotspot. So in the locked door blueprint, we're going to override the item use succeed, delete that parent node, and then we'll run our chain of commands here. So the first thing we'll do is face the hotspot, and then we'll bark and we'll say, hey, that worked. And if we were to test this out, we would see that clicking on the tower door just makes you walk through the door. So if you see the Levels tab, if you click that controller icon next to Tower Exterior, it will open the level blueprint. And if you make the window kind of smaller, then you can also open the Tower Exterior level and drag in like the door blueprint, and you'll have a reference to that door in this blueprint. So right at the beginning, we need to run something that makes that tower door invisible. So if we go over to the Hotspot blueprint, we can add another function that we'll just call Enable Hotspot. And then while we're at it, we'll make another one called Disable Hotspot. And in the Enable Hotspot function, the first thing it can do is set actor enable collision. And since this is not a Sprite-based blueprint, we don't need to do anything except for remove collision. So for the Enable Hotspot, tick that box to make it so that it does collide. And for Disable Hotspot, do the same thing, but make sure that that is not ticked. So that means in the tower exterior blueprint, we can actually take that door and disable the hotspot on begin play. So then if we were to play, you would see that it's just the locked door and not the door to the interior of the tower. So if we picked up the knife, we picked up the poster, use the knife on the pickle, we have the key, and we use the key on the locked door, the character walks over and he does not say what he needs to. And that's because we need to assign the interactable item on the locked door. So right now it's set to none, it needs to be pickle key. So testing that out, pick up the knife, pick up the poster, use knife on pickle, pickle key, use pickle key on locked door. He says, hey, that worked. However, it's not clearing, so we need to clear the verb. We forgot to do that too. So in the locked door blueprint, we'll just add the clear verb at the end here. And then we can also remove the pickle key from our inventory. But now we need to hide the locked door and show the door to the tower interior. So back on the tower exterior blueprint, let's add a custom event. And we can call this something like unlock tower door. And if we make it small again and we drag in the locked door blueprint, now we have the things that we need to interact with. So from the locked door, we can hide the pickup, and then we can copy the door reference and enable the hotspot. So now once this event is fired, it will do exactly what we need. So in order to do that, let's run an event dispatcher called unlock tower door dispatcher. And then we can call that right at the end of this chain. Now, in order for it to be registered in the level blueprint, all we need to do on begin play is drag out from the locked door and bind event to the door dispatcher and connect it up to the unlock tower door event. Now let's try it out and see how it runs. So I don't walk through the door and I pick up the knife, and now I have the knife. Pick up the poster, and now I have a pickle. I use the knife on the pickle, carve that key, and then if I use that key on the locked door, he says, hey, that worked. Everything's gone from my inventory, and I can walk in to the tower. The only issue now that we're not going to deal with in this episode is that when you leave, everything is reset because nothing is saved. That is going to be for another tutorial section, though. We have successfully completed the inventory area of this tutorial, and now we have a working inventory that you can use on different items, and you can use items on hotspots and everything. So thank you for watching. That was a lot of stuff to go through. I'm very pleased with how it turned out. I hope you are too. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please hit like. And if you're not subscribed, please do so. Also, hit the bell thing, and you'll be notified when I upload new videos. Thank you again, and I'll see you next video.